I'm Stephen Toop, and I have the honor to serve as president of the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you this afternoon for today's Big Thinking lecture. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We are very excited about the remarkable preparations undertaken by our host, the University of Calgary, for Congress this week, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the people from the University of Calgary who've done such a wonderful job in welcoming us. Please join me. J'aimerais aussi signaler, avant de commencer, que nous proposons un service d'interprétation simultanée. Vous pourriez vous procurer des écouteurs dans la salle située à l'extérieur du théâtre. Je souhaite remercier le Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, la Fondation canadienne pour l'innovation et Université Canada pour leur parrainage de la série de causeries Voir Grande. It's thanks to the generosity of these sponsors that we are able to make these events open to the public for all to enjoy. The Big Thinking series gives us a chance to engage in conversations about the pressing issues of our time, and today is no exception. I'm personally delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Beverley McLachlin, Chief Justice of Canada, who I have no doubt will provoke and engage us as she discusses the fundamental challenges of preserving the rule of law in a multicultural society. I'd now like to invite Alistair Lucas, former Dean of Law at the University of Calgary, to introduce Chief Justice McLachlin. Dean Lucas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin must feel right at home today. She spent her formative years in Pincher Creek, south of Calgary, earned her BA and her master's degree in philosophy, as well as her law degree from the University of Alberta. After being called to the bars of both Alberta and British Columbia, she practiced law in both provinces, after which she took on a teaching role at the University of British Columbia Law School, which she continued until 1981. In April of that year, the Chief Justice was appointed to the Vancouver County Court, marking the beginning of her judicial career. That September, she was appointed to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, followed by an appointment to the British Columbia Court of Appeal in 1985. Her rapid trajectory didn't stop there, as she was appointed Chief Justice of British Columbia of the Supreme Court of British Columbia in 1988, and 7 months later was sworn in as a Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. On January 7th, 2000, she was appointed Chief Justice of Canada, the first woman to hold that position. In addition to her judicial duties, the Chief Justice chairs the Canadian Judicial Council, the Advisory Council of the Order of Canada, and the Board of Governors of the National Judicial Institute. Apart from her judgments, and she is extremely prolific there, she has been a very prolific writer and presenter, addressing important societal legal issues, including access to justice and civil liberties. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin.
Merci Al, c'est toujours un plaisir de me retrouver en Alberta du Sud et surtout dans la ville de Calgary. Alors merci beaucoup pour cette introduction et merci à tous et à toutes pour être ici aujourd'hui. My topic today, as you know, is the challenge of diversity and how the rule of law fits in with that. Let me begin with a question. What is the single most challenging issue facing the world today? Well, you probably all have some answer that comes to the top of your mind, and no doubt the answers are different. Climate change, poverty, starvation, disease, isolation, war, all of these are pressing issues facing countries everywhere in the world. But my choice for the single most challenging issue facing the world today is related to all of the above, but it's a little different. And it's the issue of how we deal with diversity in society. Everywhere in the world, nations are, it seems, wrestling with this question. How do we deal with what's called the other, with the person who is different in a majoritarian society? Sometimes the other is a racial or ethnic minority of long standing, Blacks in America or Indigenous people in Canada, for example. Sometimes the other are newcomers, immigrants, and refugees seeking respite from poverty, violence, and war. A glance at international headlines tells the story. In Europe, nations are engaged in a variety of strategies, from expulsion to Brexit, to stem the tide of refugees from war-riven societies like Syria and North Africa. In Asia, cultural and racial differences breed low-level civil wars and violence. In Africa, tribal and religious fighting rages, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. In the United States, a presidential candidate proposes to exclude Muslims and build a wall on the Mexican border to keep the other out, to considerable popular acclaim. In Canada, relations with Indigenous peoples figure in a variety of debates, from pipelines to suicide epidemics in remote communities. The same newspaper headlines reveal two diametrically opposed responses to the perceived threat of the other in our midst. The first response is exclusion. Imposed exclusion. Keep them out, send them home, build a wall, tragically, in some parts of the world, eradicate them. Or self-imposed exclusion. Withdrawal into identity ghettos based on race or religion. The second response is inclusion. Accept the presence of the other in our midst, deal with those different from ourselves with respect and dignity. Don't retreat, engage, or as Michelle Obama said recently in a graduation address, go where the noise is. Work to improve the situation of the marginalized and strengthen the bonds between disparate communities. Canada, with some lapses, to be sure, has opted for the second response, the response of inclusion. Or more accurately, history has thrust this response on Canada. Canada has never been an ethnically homogeneous place. It has always been a place of different and diverse peoples, peoples of different cultures and languages. John Ralston Saul, in his book, A Fair Country, describes Canada's cultural history as emerging from three strands: Aboriginal, in itself immensely diverse, French and English, overlain in successive decades by waves of immigration from every part of the world. Diversity characterized the early interactions between Europeans and Indigenous peoples. Faced with harsh climate and difficult terrain, Canada's first European colonists survived by learning from the culturally and linguistically diverse Indigenous peoples, working with them as equals. Similarly, when the country came together in 1867, it was a union between two very different types of peoples, French and English, who had been locked in bitter warfare for decades. They spoke different languages and practiced different religions and suffered from the accumulated hostilities associated with a century of intermittent warfare between England and France. Yet the constitutional framework that our forefathers devised reflected an ethic of inclusion and accommodation of diversity. They opted for a federal union that recognized regional specificity, and in the Union's founding document, the British North America Act of 1867, they provided language and education guarantees for minorities. I haven't done the research, but I think that must have been singular for constitutions such as they were at that time. Inclusion and accommodation of diversity continued to define Canada as successive waves of immigration washed over the country. The Great Migration of Canada brought over 800,000 people from Britain between 1815 and 1850, and then there was the migration at the end of the 19th century and the 20th, beginning of the 20th, from places all over Europe. In 1913, the high water mark of Canada's immigration saw over 400,000 immigrants come to the country. Influx continued through the Roaring '20s, and the aftermath of World War II brought large numbers of refugees and immigrants. 1.5 million came from Europe in the 1950s. Refugees in subsequent years have followed in the thousands from places as diverse as Uganda, Chile, Vietnam, and Kosovo. Between 2009 and 2013, Canada admitted on average 257,000 new permanent residents every year, and last year is estimated to have admitted somewhere between 260 and 285,000, and we all know the story of the recent welcome that Canadians gave to Syrian refugees. In sum, Canada has never been a monolith. It has never had a single defining culture or language. Most Canadians count immigrants or Aboriginals among their ancestors. We are, to use Saul's phrase, a Métis nation, diverse yet unified. Unity in diversity is our character. We sometimes lament our lack of a defining culture or language. We see it as a deficit, but our deficit is also our asset. As our Prime Minister put it on a recent visit to England, and I quote, "Our diversity isn't a challenge to be overcome or a difficulty to be tolerated. Rather, it's a tremendous source of strength." The result, we hope, is a just society, or at least a society closing in on justice, a society where everyone is respected and everybody has opportunity, a society for which a former Prime Minister, the father of the current, wished when he said, and I quote, "I've always dreamed of a society where each person should be able to fulfill himself to the extent of his capabilities as a human being. A society where inhibitions to equality would be eradicated. This means providing individual freedoms, equality of opportunity, health, education, and I conceive of politics as a series of decisions to create this society." We have traveled a good distance toward that dream, yet we cannot rest on our laurels. Canada may rightly pride itself on having managed diversity relatively well. We may take satisfaction in world leaders like the Aga Khan applauding our generous and respectful treatment and welcome of minorities. Yet there is work to be done, as reports of discrimination against members and Aboriginal communities attest. Even where we have succeeded, the battle is not over. Accommodation is an ongoing process. To rest on our laurels is to fail. This backdrop brings me to the second part of my talk, how we maintain a strong and cohesive society in the face of diversity, because it is a process. It is never done. How do we ensure that diversity will continue to be our strength? I will suggest that two things are essential to this goal. First, that individuals act in ways that promote inclusion of minorities and all facets of economic life, what I call a culture of inclusion. And second, that we have institutions that back up and carry forward this ethos of inclusion, most critically legislatures, the executive, the courts, and the rule of law. Let me talk for a moment about individual action and the culture of inclusion. Diversity is a process, as I've said, a way of living together through myriad social interactions. It is a process in which every Canadian must engage on a daily basis, whether as part of a minority group or as member of a cultural and social majority. When life brings us into contact with a man of a different color or a woman in a hijab, we have a choice. Will we acknowledge the person's difference as an asset, or will we look away? Will we accept the person in the spirit of full respect, equality, and inclusion as one of us, or will we devalue her, discriminate against her, perhaps even unconsciously? The choices are continuous and they are ours. We cannot delegate the business of building an inclusive society to governments or the courts. They can help, but they can never be the foundation. The front line in the quest for societal inclusion is what we as individuals do in our moment-to-moment, day-to-day lives. Let me tell you a story to make the point. I grew up, as you've heard, not far from here, on a modest ranch in the foothills of southern Alberta. In 2000, many, many years later, I was invited to participate in the centennial celebrations of our little town, Pincher Creek. It was a splendid affair, with a horse-drawn carriage for my husband and me to ride in, an exhibit of the art of A.Y. Jackson, who had spent time in the area and left a legacy of small pictures to families with which he had stayed, capped off by an afternoon reception where people came to say hello and to mingle. At some point in the afternoon, a tall Indigenous man and his striking wife approached me. The man handed me a small box containing handcrafted earrings of mother of pearl. The man, Eric was his name, said he was happy to see me, but he had brought the gift out of respect for my parents, who had then passed on. He said he respected them for their actions and for their values. Tell me why, I asked. And then Eric recounted an incident that I had long forgotten. I was a child. It was a hot July Sunday. His father, a pagan from the nearby Brockett Reserve, came to see my father about some business and brought his wife and children along in the car. My father went out to the car and the two men talked. And then my mother came out of the house, Eric told me, and walked down to the car. She looked at the passel of kids crammed in the back seat, it was before seatbelt legislation, and said, "Why don't you come up to the house for tea? It's my husband's birthday and you can help celebrate." So the family accepted, and we all sat around the dining room table and had tea and pieces of birthday cake. I got the dime, Eric told me much later on the afternoon that I'm recounting, referring to the coin my mother always put in the batter of a birthday cake. But he went on, "But that's not the main reason I will never forget that afternoon. It was the first time I had ever been in a white person's house." Eric and his wife went their way, and I went mine. But our encounter affected me profoundly. I understood inclusion in a new and different way. I understood how the simple acts of everyday people could make a profound difference in a child's life. I thought about how those acts can be acts of inclusion, like my mother's, or acts of indifference or exclusion. And I understood in a profound sense I had not previously felt that the responsibility for an inclusive, diverse society belongs most fundamentally to each of us as an individual. How do we inculcate and maintain the ethic of inclusion in the women, men, and children who make up Canada? The answer to this question is one word: culture. We must foster a culture in which people of all backgrounds, minorities and majorities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, descendants of many generations and those who have just come, see themselves and their fellow citizens as Canadians, to be treated with full dignity and respect. In a word, to be included. There are many ways to foster the culture of inclusion. We can do it through our individual actions. We can do it through discussion, private and public, on our diverse makeup, the problems it produces, and the solutions to those problems. We can do it through our churches and synagogues and mosques and through our community organizations. We can do it by ensuring that our cultural, government, and educational institutions reflect the diversity of our nation. Critically, we can do it through education. Children and new Canadians need to understand Canada's history of inclusion. They need to understand our values and the institutions that uphold those values. The second way in which we maintain an inclusive society is through managing inclusion through our institutions. The most basic responsibility, of course, for maintaining inclusive society rests with each of us as individuals. However, individual deeds aren't enough. They have to be backed up by inclusive laws and inclusive institutions. Our laws and institutions carry our values as a society forward from generation to generation. They inform and confirm who we are as a collectivity. They tell us quite simply what our nation stands for. When we fall short, they remind us of what we should be and what we should do, and they hold us to it. Each of the three branches of governance has a role to play in building and maintaining an inclusive society. Parliament and the legislatures bear the responsibility of enacting laws that reflect the diversity of our population and that ensure that everyone, regardless of race, creed, or culture, is treated fairly and equally. They may also be called on to pass laws that rectify past injustices and settle past wrongs, healing wounds inflicted long ago. The apology of then Prime Minister Stephen Harper in Parliament for the injuries inflicted on Indigenous peoples in residential schools, followed up by laws establishing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, provides an example. The executive branch of government, Cabinet, and the myriad agencies that administer the laws passed by the legislative branch also have an important role to play in establishing and maintaining an inclusive society. The law must be administered without discrimination, and governments must, in their dealings with Indigenous people, uphold the honor of the Crown. Finally, the judicial branch plays a crucial role in managing diversity and maintaining an inclusive society. In a diverse, multicultural society, conflicts between peoples of different backgrounds and cultures is inevitable. The courts play a critical role in resolving these conflicts. They also ensure that the laws passed by the legislative branch and the actions of the executive conform to the guarantees of minority rights found in the Constitution Act 1982 and to the basic tenets of the rule of law. We all know, of course, that the Constitution Act of 1982 gave constitutional recognition and affirmation to Aboriginal and treaty rights of Canada's First Peoples and introduced the Constitutional Bill of Rights, the Charter, which, as a document of inclusion and accommodation, is well suited to the diverse makeup of Canadian society. The rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter include equal treatment of men and women, Section 28, as well as the General Equality Guarantee, Section 15, and in Section 27 instruct us to interpret the Charter in a manner consistent with the preservation and enhancement of the multicultural heritage of Canada. The Charter guarantees and associated Aboriginal and minority rights guarantees that sustain it are grounded and attuned to Canada's history. Respect for diversity and accommodation are built into the very architecture of the country. In the secession reference, the Court drew from this history 4 fundamental planks on which our constitutional structure rests: the principles of federalism, democracy, respect for minorities, and constitutionalism and the rule of law. 2 of these fundamental planks, respect for minorities and the rule of law, are deeply connected to the process of maintaining an inclusive society in the face of diversity. Respect for minorities means what the words say. Minorities must be respected and accommodated. Their rights cannot be trampled. But what is meant by the rule of law, and how does it support an inclusive society? The rule of law stands for 3 simple principles, I think, each tied to an inclusive society. The principle of universality means the law applies to everyone, including governments, and that everyone, no matter what their background or how recently or anciently they came to Canada, has the full benefit of the law. The principle of legality insists on a comprehensive suite of legal norms which set out rights and obligations in advance and guard against arbitrary exercise of state power against anyone, including the usual targets of such arbitrariness, members of minority groups and marginalized people. The third principle is the principle of accountability, and it ties up the package by ensuring that all who exercise power must be accountable for that exercise through the law as applied by independent and impartial courts. Those who violate the legal norms of equality can be made to answer. The rule of law means that conflicts between groups within society are resolved peacefully and fairly. In countries with rule of law deficits, disputes may be settled by force, and government powers may be exercised arbitrarily against minorities. Without a deep culture of the rule of law, stability, security, and prosperity are elusive in a diverse, multicultural society. The courts play a vital role in assuring that the conflicts that inevitably arise in a diverse society, and conflicts there are and always will be, are resolved in accordance with the Constitution and the rule of law. The Supreme Court of Canada has been called on to resolve a steady stream of intercultural issues that, if left unresolved, might lead to cultural struggles and undermine the ethos of inclusivity. These include, to give a few examples only, whether a Jew can erect a sukkah or a small religious structure on his balcony in defiance of condo rules, whether a Muslim woman is required to remove her face covering when testifying in court, whether a Sikh boy can carry a small ceremonial dagger sewn in his clothing in a school with a no weapons policy, and whether members of a municipal council may recite a prayer at the start of their meetings. These are issues at base of how we live together in a diverse society. They are controversial. Emotions often run high on all sides. Sometimes in the lead up to the court hearing, violence threatens. Yet time and time again, the issues are resolved peacefully through the legal process, tempers cool, and people get on with their lives. Along the way, people come to better understand how to peacefully live together in a diverse, multicultural society. The same applies to resolving issues pertaining to Aboriginal and Indigenous communities. In recent decades, the Supreme Court of Canada, building on the work of trial and appellate courts across the country, has been involved in resolution of long-standing issues relating to land claims, treaties, and ancestral rights. Legislatures and government agents are now moving forward on the basis of these templates. It is a process of reconciliation in which all must engage. If our country is to move on in unity and peace, these issues must be resolved. As former Chief Justice Lemaire stated in the landmark Delgamuukw decision, let us face it, we are all here to stay. If the courts are to perform their role of resolving these conflicts and legal issues, two things are essential. First, people must be able to access the courts, and I've spoken in other forums at length and passionately about the need for complete access to justice. Second, the courts must continue to enjoy the trust and respect of the public. Judges must understand and respect the bounds of the judicial role, and they must be seen to be impartial, wise, and above reproach, so that even those who may not agree with a decision can accept it. Let me recap my principal points briefly and conclude. Number one, dealing with diversity within the bosom of a nation is a critical issue confronting nations around the world. There are two possible responses. One is exclusion, the other is inclusion. Number two, Canada, a diverse multicultural nation, has chosen the course of inclusion. This is not a weakness, this is our strength. Number three, while we have done well by and large in achieving an inclusive society, the job is not finished. There is more to be done. Number four, the first thing we must do to maintain an inclusive multicultural society is foster a culture of inclusion that results in individual actions of inclusion. These include dialogue, discussion, making our institutions reflective of our diverse makeup, education, and a commitment everywhere to inclusion and accommodation. Number two, the second thing we must do is to support the institutions that make inclusivity work and continue to make those institutions work, be they community groups, churches, or institutions of governance, the legislatures, the executive, and the judicial branch. And finally, number six, the courts play a vital role in upholding the rule of law and maintaining an inclusive multicultural society by resolving the conflicts in which a diverse society inevitably produces by peaceful process rather than confrontation and violence. In carrying out this task, they rely on the guarantees of individual and Aboriginal rights enshrined in the Canadian Constitution in 1982 and on the tenets of the rule of law. I believe that Canada's future depends on how we respond to these 6 points. It depends on recognizing our history deeply rooted in the soil of diversity. It depends on recognizing the need to reject exclusion in favor of a culture of inclusion. It depends on cultivating attitudes not only of tolerance, but of value for diversity and inclusion. It depends on maintaining strong legislative, executive, and judicial institutions to maintain our inclusion. If we get these things right, we will move forward. Our diversity, already our nation's great strength, will become an asset of inestimable worth. To be sure, the way forward will not always be easy, but we should take comfort in the fact that we have weathered the storms of the first 150 years of our history, and we have emerged in a better, more unified place than where we began. Let me leave you with a metaphor proposed by contemporary Canadian philosopher James Tully. Tully likens the Canadian journey to a sculpture named The Spirit of the Haida Gwaii, the masterpiece of Haida artist Bill Reid. You may have seen this sculpture in the Vancouver Airport terminal or on the backs of older $20 bills. It's a large, dark bronze, traditional Haida canoe, carrying a motley crew: the raven, the grizzly bear with his wife and their cubs, the eagle, the frog. In the middle of the crowded canoe sits a quiet figure, the human shaman, looking forward. Tully explains his constitutional metaphor as follows, and I quote, "The passengers are squabbling and vying for recognition and position, each in their culturally distinct way. They are exchanging their diverse stories and claims as the chief appears to listen attentively to each, hoping to guide them to reach an agreement." End of quote. Over the centuries, the passengers in the Canadian ship of state, Indigenous peoples, European settlers, immigrants and refugees, have all contributed to the conversation in the boat in their unique ways. They have squabbled, they have vied for recognition, but what distinguishes the Canadian experience is that these passengers have not only squabbled and vied for recognition, they have also listened to each other, sometimes belatedly, sometimes incompletely, but more so than in many nations, they have shared their stories in a spirit of respect, and from that respect has come inclusion and accommodation. The result is an overarching story that belongs to all of us, a story of the rights and limits enshrined in our Constitution and preserved by our legislatures and our courts. The national boat moves forward, often by fits and starts, sometimes unsure of its ultimate goal, but thus far, touch wood, always forward. Sometimes the process is difficult, often it is imperfect. One person wants this, the other person wants that. The key is to listen to each other. Listen directly and listen through our modern shaman, the rule of law. There is no other way forward. For diverse as we are all in the same boat. I close with the words of the sculptor, Bill Reed himself, the man behind the spirit of the Haida Gwaii, a man who understood profoundly, I think, the value of inclusion and diversity. He said this, "Here we are at last, a long way from Haida Gwaii, not too sure where we are or where we're going, still squabbling and vying for position in the boat, but somehow managing to appear to be heading in the same direction. At least the paddles are together, and the man in the middle seems to have some vision of what is to come." Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Chief Justice, for sharing the wonderful story of Eric and his family and for a vision that I think most Canadians would find compelling. We now have an opportunity to hear from folk in the audience, and I would invite any of you who would like to pose questions to come forward to one of the microphones in either of the aisles. Vous pouvez poser vos questions en anglais ou français. And I would ask you to introduce yourself, and please try to make your questions brief so we can get in as many as possible. And please make the questions of an interrogatory nature. Thank you. Go ahead.
Shall I? Oh,
now it's on.
Now it works. My name is Juliette Keyshawn. I teach law in the Faculty of Medicine here at the University of Calgary. Yesterday, there was a session on physician-assisted dying, and the person seated to my left said at the end of it, "This is going too fast. We don't know anything about this." And I asked her what her field was, and it was education. And it occurred to me that there's something missing because this action began in April of 2011. And I'm wondering if you believe that there's perhaps two problems that sometimes arise in judicial decision-making: lack of knowledge translation and fear.
I'm not quite sure what to do with your problems.
Sorry,
lack of
what I mean to
knowledge
say-
transmission, you're referring to the educational piece?
I'm referring to the fact that the court gave a very fulsome response to the litigation, and yet the public, some members of the public, don't know about it, or they're fearful of it. And I know you can't speak specifically about a particular case, but do you see this in terms of dispute resolution as one of the challenges that we have in Canada, that we have to transmit the knowledge that comes to us from the court, and that we have to help people adjust?
Well, I do see that as very important, and there was a time many decades ago when judges never gave public talks. Courts always, of course, have spoken through their judgments, as they continue to do. But we recognized that it's very important for courts to communicate with the public. The first and most important way we communicate is through our reasons. And the reasons in the case you're speaking of are quite detailed and quite long, and I think quite readable. One of my personal efforts has been to write our judgments in language that any literate person can understand, because I believe those judgments belong to the people, and they have to be read and understood by the people, rather than simply being accessed through the medium of a lawyer who has somehow pre-digested it. It's very important as well that the press be involved in this, and we in the court have gone a long way to facilitating the press understanding our decisions. We have pre-briefings, we have lockups, so the press goes away with a very good idea. And they publish it in the newspapers, and they publish it in the various other media. And these things do get a lot of attention. So I think the word is out there when we make an important decision, such as the one to which you are referring. Is it accessed? Is it taken up by ordinary people? Do people think, well, this is something that I don't have to worry about now. I'll think about football, or I'll think about something else important. In fact, the court initiated what was to be a process, and Parliament has to play its role in that process, and so on. And that's where we are now. And you know, I also think that there's two things here. If you say things do take a while, but if you never have the issue crystallized, as we've had in this case, then nothing ever happens. People take all the time that is given to them. Suddenly, decision time comes, and we have a full public debate. And that may take a while. I'm not here to comment on anything political, please. But I just think it's part of the process. I'm not alarmed.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi. So in this age of globalization and trade agreements, there is, I believe, a lot of fear from certain members of society, both from the seeming rise of extremism and in the outsourcing of jobs, and the feeling that perhaps for a lot of Donald Trump supporters, the idea that illegal immigrants are here to take our jobs. Do we, in your opinion, as members of the society and as society in general, have a responsibility to alleviate some of these fears and address some of their concerns?
Yeah, well, that's why I spoke about dialogue and listening. I mean, we have to talk about the issues, and we have to hopefully encourage a dialogue at all levels. And but one of the things that sometimes happens, and I alluded to it briefly, is that instead of talking to each other, we retreat into isolation. And that is one of the dangers, I think, that multicultural societies or diverse societies face, that instead of coming together and talking and staying in that same boat that I used as my concluding image, they divide up into little silos. And I see this dialogue and listening as the way forward, dividing into silos or ghettos and just shouting at each other as the opposite.
I'm noticing that there are now lots of people waiting to speak, and I apologize in advance. It's going to be very hard to get to everyone. I don't think we'll get any more space than the people who are already standing. And I think I will ask a couple of people to pose their questions on this side, and then we'll move to the other sides. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. My name's Kyle Gardner. I'm a law student here at the university. Chief Justice, your colleague Justice Bella came to visit a couple months ago, and she talked about a lot of things, but spoke a little bit about certain members of the Supreme Court in the United States. And you mentioned earlier certain exclusionary policies that are gaining considerable appeal south of the border. And I was wondering if you could talk about, I guess, what role the courts in the United States and in Canada could play specifically in the face of very strong exclusionary policy.
Well, I hope we don't have that, and we never have to face that in our country, and I'm ill-equipped to comment on what might happen in the United States, but I've indicated that courts can be there to hold us to our basic values, to resolve some of the disputes. We all know the huge role the United States Supreme Court played in the 60s, Brown versus Board of Education, and ending segregation. So courts, the judicial branch of governance has a huge role to play. Just what it will be, we don't know till the issue actually arises. But I think that the presence of a strong and independent judiciary is absolutely essential to any nation that wants to navigate the difficult waters of diversity.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mabetsi Akau Taansi Chris Albanati. I'm a Sinai Filipino and Irish French Canadian. I'm a lawyer. I practice in Ontario and also a grad student at Osgood, doing work there. My question is complicated but straightforward. This idea of inclusion, this idea of the rule of law, this idea of equality assumes a moral equivalency between individuals in that society, between the individuals in this Haida canoe, in this ship called the Canadian state. And I'm puzzled, I just wrestle with this. Given the history, not just the history, but the reality of colonization, which is, for many Indigenous peoples in this country, often violent, what justifies that assumption of moral equivalency, which seems to be required for inclusion to really take hold?
Well, I'm not going to tackle moral equivalency because it has all sorts of shades that I'm not quite sure I'm willing to deconstruct or able to deconstruct. But we have to go on the premise that we have a legal equivalency, that we have an equivalency of human dignity, we have an equivalency of partnership in this country, and maybe that will get us some distance. And so that's all I can really helpfully say on that.
Yes.
Guy Laforêt, département de sciences politiques de l'Université Laval. Merci, Madame, pour votre conférence. Vous avez mentionné dans la conférence le rôle de deux principes, la primauté du droit et le respect des droits des minorités dans une culture de l'inclusion. À la veille du 150e anniversaire de notre Constitution fédérale, quelle est la place pour vous du principe du fédéralisme dans notre culture de l'inclusion?
Alors, le fédéralisme est absolument un concept unique et fondamental parce que c'est le fondement de notre nation et c'est une manière dans laquelle nous respectons les différences dans les différentes parties du Québec. En 1867, le Canada a été fondé comme un État fédéral parce qu'on voulait respecter les différences. Alors, cet respect pour les différences est fondamental. Ça doit continuer et s'exprimer à travers le fédéralisme.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Aaliyah Darcy. I'm a reporter at the Calgary Herald. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how well you think Canada is progressing on inclusivity when it comes to Indigenous people and kind of the history of the poor treatment of Indigenous people, and to the extent that you can comment on it, how you think the actions by the current government are contributing to tackling that issue.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the actions of the current government. And nor am I equipped to, take a barometer and say, or a yardstick and say, well, you got A+, you got B, you got C. It's a long history, and it's one at which we have to continue to work. And it has its painful chapters. We all know what they are. I prefer to focus on moving forward. And I think that we are now, as the courts have said, from my perspective as a jurist, engaged in a process of reconciliation in which everyone must be engaged. I think it's a time when we're being more honest and straightforward about what the problems are and what the different hopes and desires are, and I think that's hopeful. I think that's probably where I should end my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Panasefi, and I'm a law student at Thompson Rivers University. My question is that, given Canada's history of civil and common law, should inclusion and accommodation be construed as the Canadian system being open to the existence of other legal systems? So whether it be Aboriginal or religious, such as Sharia laws?
You're really asking me to comment on where we might go in the future. I think we have our law, as I see it, embodied in our Constitution. But the common law, and I think the civil law too, are quite capable of absorbing and reconciling different streams. Our law is supreme, as set out in our Constitution and in the laws that flow from it. But my hope is that other elements, values, for example, in the Indigenous tradition can be respected. And there are lots and lots of models about how we can see legal problems through, for example, an Aboriginal perspective, and use sentencing circles or use other non-traditional legal techniques or legal processes to achieve justice. Because what we all want in the end is justice. We want something that works. It's not about imposing on anything. We work with what we have. We work within those structures to hopefully find a home for Indigenous values, hopefully to achieve what a Canadian looking at that would say, this is justice for me. And I think our courts are committed to that. As far as setting up, totally different legal regimes, that's something I haven't even begun to think about. That's much more complicated because you're talking about basic fundamental constitutional reform. But working within our structures, yes, there's lots of room for inclusive values, particularly in the Indigenous area, provided there's compatibility and provided that we can all work forward together.
Thank you.
Last question over here.
I thought I saw someone over there.
She left. Go ahead.
This is... I'm Dr. Resha Chowdhury, and my question is based on my ongoing research on equity issues in social policies.
Equity.
Equity issues.
Yeah. The question is that there are these invisible norms in most of our policies, healthcare or in other sectors, where the assumptions are that the values and the beliefs of the consumer or the client has to align with the norms, the values and the beliefs. Sometimes these are not visible, but invisible norms. And if they don't, if there are any variations from those norms, then these are perceived as deviations to be remedied through acculturation processes. Mm-hmm. So when you so beautifully talk about respecting the differences, and the reality goes on the other side. I'm just confused. I'm just wondering what do we do to bridge that gap?
Well, I suppose we should, as a society, be able to talk about changing our norms and moving. And that's what the dialogue is all about. That's what the conversation in the canoe is about. It's not just, I have to bend to your norm or you have to bend to mine. It's about changing, talking and saying, well, maybe we could make that difference and that would respect your perspective and maybe it would work better. So I hope we can avoid, in most of these areas, the straitjacket of saying there's an absolute norm, everyone has to conform to it. And what we need to cultivate is an idea of openness, I think, and saying, okay, maybe I haven't got the corner on all the knowledge or all the effective ways to deal with a problem. I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to be open. It doesn't sound very profound, but actually maybe it is. It's the only way I can figure out that we can overcome these differences because if anyone feels they're being forced to conform to a norm which they don't agree with, which they reject at some fundamental level, at that point you have anger, you have resentment, you have exclusion. Perhaps the person just retreats into their own little ghetto and imposes exclusion on themselves. Perhaps it's more broadly conceived socially. Perhaps it provokes another. Those are all negative dialogues. I think the only way forward is to accept that norms can change, that we can change the modalities by which we accomplish certain tasks that everybody agrees are important, and still remaining true to our fundamental values, which, if you look at our Constitution, are things that most right-thinking people would agree with.
Before we conclude, I want to thank again the University of Calgary. I want to thank our sponsors, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Universities Canada, the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And I want to remind you that there are a number of big thinking events throughout the week. Tomorrow's Big Thinking lecture features journalist Chantal Hébert, who will be discussing covering Canadian politics in an era of social media. And the event will take place en français, ici, dans la salle Eckhart-Grammaté at 12:15. All of these Big Thinking lectures are videotaped, and I invite you to access the lectures at congress2016.ca. Please join me in thanking our Chief Justice for a wonderful presentation.